One of the stories to come out of the Day of Reckoning card was that of young heavyweight Daniel Dubois after he managed to come through the mid-fight fire and stop Jarrell Big Baby Miller. Now, does this prove that Daniel Dubois is actually very good, or does this just prove that Jarrell Big Baby Miller is pretty shit without the old Ped Sheerans in his system? Well, I would argue that it's probably somewhere in the middle. But now we are hearing Daniel Dubois' promoter, Frank Warren, saying he would be willing to make a domestic heavyweight showdown between Daniel Dubois and Anthony Joshua. But just how realistic is this potential Dubois-Joshua showdown? And if not Anthony Joshua, who next for Daniel Dubois? Right, people, what's happening? And welcome back to the Joey Knight Boxing channel. If you are new around here, at the end of the video, if you like the content and you want to see more from myself, please hit that subscribe button. Also, do me a massive favor right now, smash that like button to help me be able to pump more of this sort of content out for you guys. Let's get into the video. So Daniel Dubois turned pro in 2017 under the careful guidance of promoter Frank Warren, and Frank kept him busy fighting every couple of months, and by the end of 2017 he could already boast a 6-0 record. But in my opinion, his first real challenge came in his ninth fight when he took on experienced heavyweight journeyman Kevin Johnson. Now, Kevin Johnson doesn't usually win nowadays, but at least at the time, one thing that didn't usually happen to Kevin Johnson is he didn't usually get stopped. Because going into the Dubois fight, Kevin Johnson had just been stopped twice, one being at the hands of Anthony Joshua, and he had gone the distance with heavyweights such as Vitaly Klitschko, Tyson Fury, Chisora, Pulev, Andy Ruiz, Hrgovic, Caballero, and so many more. So the fact that Dubois failed to stop Kevin Johnson didn't really teach us much. It was a good learning fight where he got rounds under his belt. But the highest praise that we could really give Kevin Johnson is that of his durability, and at this point it felt like we needed to see Dubois in with an opponent who comes to win, who believes in himself and has the courage to fight fire with fire. And after a few more fights, we finally saw that when Daniel Dubois took on, at the time, a relatively unknown heavyweight in Richard Lartey. And this was the first fight that we really learned a thing or two about Daniel Dubois, because Lartey did not read the script. Lartey showed some serious Ghanaian warrior spirit and came for a shootout with Daniel Dubois. But after a 4-round shootout in which Dubois had to show his heart and his ability to take a shot, he eventually managed to stop Richard Lartey, which propelled him into a domestic showdown against Nathan Gorman. Both men were young heavyweight prospects signed to Frank Warren at the time, and their styles could not have been more conflicting, not just in their personality but also in the boxing ring. Dubois was considered that of a knockout merchant coming up, whereas Nathan Gorman had a few more silky smooth boxing skills that we often associate with fighters from the gypsy community. Now, Dubois was actually the favourite with the bookies, but I remember strongly smelling an upset in this fight, so much so that I'm pretty sure I even put some money on Nathan Gorman to win the fight on a points decision. However, Dubois came through that fight, stopping his domestic rival within 5 rounds, and it was at this point that I realised we had a serious contender on our hands. And not only that, it was at this point that we started to hear stories that Daniel Dubois had been in camp with Anthony Joshua, sparring him, and had dropped him. But listen, as much as word had it that Dubois had dropped Anthony Joshua, there's a lot of rumours about a lot of fighters dropping Anthony Joshua in sparring. So the ability to separate fact from fiction isn't really something we have. We've heard that David Price, Martin Bakole, Lawrence Okoli, lots of other heavyweights have apparently dropped Anthony Joshua in sparring, but not many of them have actually confirmed it until Dubois did.
Is there any truth to you actually knocking down Anthony Joshua in sparring in the past?
Yes, there is definitely truth to that. I'm not going to deny it.
So now we had a big punching heavyweight knockout artist working his way through the scene and confirming to us that he had laid AJ out in sparring. But the two weren't necessarily on a collision course, and Dubois carries on going about his business, fighting regularly until during the pandemic he accepts the fight with former Olympian Joyce. Now, to some people that didn't follow these two fighters that closely, they could have been guilty as thinking this was a very evenly matched fight, because the pro records would suggest at the time that it was. But to people that knew about the background of Joyce, we all knew that he had a lot more experience than Daniel Dubois at the time. He had been to the Olympics, he had boxed in the World Boxing Super Series as an amateur, where he obviously fought Usyk and a couple of other names, so he was the one with the pedigree going into this fight. Now, the fight was put on behind closed doors due to the pandemic, and despite a good start to the fight from Daniel Dubois, soon his opponent, the Juggernaut, made sure it wasn't just the venue doors that were closed after he battered Daniel Dubois with jabs and straights, breaking his his orbital bone, forcing the eye closed, and forcing his opponent to quit. And a lot of people were giving Daniel Dubois a lot of stick at the time, saying about him quitting and saying that he didn't show any heart. But what I would say is 99.9% of them people could not fight their way out of a paper bag. An orbital bone break is just about as bad as it gets. When you go to the hospital with an orbital bone being broken, they suspect that you've been in a car crash, not in a boxing match, because it lines up parallel with you being in a high mile-per-hour car crash and your head or face hitting the steering wheel or hitting the dashboard. That's how bad that injury is, and that's why when you've seen the likes of Billy Joe Saunders get it against Canelo, a fighter that we don't ever associate with quitting, he did have to quit on his stool. When we saw Kell Brook get the broken orbital bone against Golovkin, there was nothing in Kell Brook's history to that point to suggest that he would quit, and he had to. You simply can't go on with a broken orbital bone. Anyway, Dubois recouped, he came back, he worked his way through a few more names on the heavyweight scene, eventually fighting Trevor Bryant for an interim world title, and then he got his shot at Alexander Usyk for the unified world heavyweight titles. Now, Dubois was an underdog in this one. Usyk was fresh off the back of back-to-back AJ wins. Not only that, Usyk in the World Boxing Super Series, the amateur version, he defeated Joyce, who obviously Daniel Dubois had a defeat himself at the hands of. So to say Dubois was an underdog would probably be an understatement. Everyone going into that fight thought that Dubois had very little chance. But Daniel Dubois actually put in a really solid performance, and some would argue this because of the stoppage, but some people, maybe not including myself, some people would say that Daniel Dubois gave Usyk way more problems than Anthony Joshua did. And in my opinion, Daniel Dubois did drop Alexander Usyk. There's the age-old debate, was it above the belt, below the belt? But that was a body shot, in my opinion. Now, that's not to say that Dubois was robbed of a world title, because I think that with Alexander Usyk's experience and his craftiness, as soon as he realises the referee sees it as a low blow, he's probably well within his right, really, and it's quite a sensible thing to do, to stay down and take as much time, as much sting out of the fight, take the adrenaline out of Daniel Dubois, who would then be looking for a stoppage had it been ruled a legit knockdown. Alexander Usyk did do the right thing in that situation, but it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that, let's say, for example, it was ruled a knockdown, Alexander Usyk wouldn't have just got up after the 6 or 8 seconds. So what I'm saying is, just because Alexander Usyk stayed down for a long time, it doesn't necessarily mean that if it was ruled a knockdown, he would have stayed down for a long time. He could have got back up, he could have carried on, and could have gone on to stop Dubois like he eventually did anyway. But what I do think this fight did was clearly told us that Daniel Dubois is very much a contender on the fringes of world level at heavyweight. Now, if we're going off the sort of fights that Frank Warren guided Daniel Dubois through after his loss to Joyce, we'd be well within our rights to think that after the Alexander Usyk loss, Daniel Dubois would go back into a rebuilding phase. But then, His Excellency, the big man, Turkey, called Warren's phone. Daniel Dubois was offered the chance to face off against former AJ scheduled opponent, Big Baby Miller, and Daniel Dubois jumped at the chance, and from start to finish, I truly do believe that this Day of Reckoning show was the making of Daniel Dubois. Daniel Dubois has been notoriously bad with his words, with his trash talking at times, but on fight week, he finally showed up with his words.
I only have a few things to say to Jarrell. Yo, big baby, every baby has a daddy, and I'm gonna beat you like I'm your daddy. Hey!
Go on, Dubois. Like it. Nice. Let's have some more of that.
I'm not worried about none of that. You know, this is Africa and we slaughter lambs out here.
Right, okay. Bit less, maybe. Rein it in a little bit. But ultimately, the talking really meant nothing, because Daniel Dubois ended up defeating Big Baby Miller, coming through some hard tests in that fight to stop him in the final round. And at this point, the world was now Daniel Dubois' oyster. He's won over a lot of fans, he's in the Saudis' good books, and he has emerged as a solid heavyweight contender. And we spoke earlier, didn't we, about the fact that Daniel Dubois said that he had dropped Anthony Joshua in sparring, and Daniel Dubois' promoter, Frank Warren, this week has said that he would relish a showdown between the two. But Let's not get too excited because we got to be honest, don't we? It's just not going to happen, is it? Dubois is not a standalone pay-per-view name just yet. And despite AJ's last 2 fights being against Franklin and Hellenius on non-pay-per-view, just a sort of monthly DAZN subscription, I very much believe, especially after the Wallin performance, that AJ's next fight will definitely be on pay-per-view. Now, just because Dubois doesn't demand pay-per-view sales on his own, let's not pretend that AJ against Dubois would not be on pay-per-view, because I'll tell you what, me, you, and every single person watching this would pay money to watch that fight. But then AJ probably makes a similar sort of amount to fight Hrgovic. That one's going to be for the world title, whereas him against Dubois wouldn't really be for anything. And then, because of that, I just think the risk against reward factor would just weigh too heavy for that fight to happen. And not only that, because of Dubois' age, if AJ was to lose to Hrgovic, but then he wanted to carry on boxing, he could still fight Dubois. So if not Anthony Joshua, then who next for Daniel Dubois? Well, there's 3 fighters whose name I am going to throw into the hat right now that I would like to see him with Dubois next. Now, before we get into it though, I just want to rule out a few fighters. It's obviously not going to be Fury or Usyk, they're tied up. It's obviously not going to be Anthony Joshua or Hrgovic, they're tied up. Deontay Wilder, I do think, will now probably retire, but we'll wait to hear more from him. So, with Dubois now edging closer to another world title shot, you know, he's in the top 10 of the WBO, the WBA, and the IBF rankings. I think he's got 2 options here. He could take on guys that he'd probably be considered as a heavy favourite against, or he can risk his ranking and try to elevate himself towards that world title shot a lot sooner than he would get there otherwise by fighting someone else within the top 10. And as a boxing fan, the latter option is obviously the one that I want to see. So I'm going to throw 3 names in the hat that I would like to see Dubois in next with. So the first guy that I would love to see Daniel Dubois in next with, and I do think it's a fight that can be made, especially off the back of that Saudi Day of Reckoning card, is Cuban heavyweight Frank Sanchez. He's got a record of 24 wins, 17 of those coming by way of stoppage. And if you look at the heavyweight rankings, especially coming off the back of that win against Junior Farr, Frank Sanchez is ranked really, really well. He's in the top 10 with every governing body. In fact, better than that, Frank Sanchez is in the top 6 of 3 out of 4 of the governing bodies, meaning if Dubois was to take the risk and fight him, if Dubois was to win, that would surely put him within touching distance of a world title shot. Now, in my opinion, this is a complete 50-50 fight. I think Dubois has got possibly the better jab, maybe the better feet. Frank Sanchez definitely looks a little bit more explosive and definitely, I'd say, a little bit quicker when he does put those shots together than Daniel Dubois. They got pretty similar records, man. Like, Dubois' best wins are what? Trevor Bryant and now Big Baby Miller. Frank Sanchez holds a win over F.A. Ajagba, who you may argue is a more impressive win than those two, but you can't argue that in defeat, Daniel Dubois definitely boxed at the higher level out of the 2 of these guys. Now, the second top 10 guy that I would love to see Daniel Dubois in with is Martin Bakole. Now, this one, much like the Frank Sanchez fight, is not one that, in my opinion, you definitely make Dubois an underdog in, but don't get me wrong, Martin Bakole is a seriously dangerous heavyweight. Since being stopped earlier on in his pro career at the hands of Michael Hunter, who we know has given tough fights to the likes of Povetkin and Usyk, Martin Bakole has hardly put a foot wrong. He's ranked in the top 10 by 2 of the sanctioning bodies and a little bit further down in the other ones, but he is coming in off the back of an impressive performance on a Saudi-backed card against Carlos Takam. He's also stopped Marius Wack, Kevin Johnson, who, as I said, not many people do, and he's got really good wins against Kuzman and, most impressively, Tony Yoka. So personally, I think that Martin Bakole is possibly one of the most dangerous heavyweight dark horses in the division, and although I probably would make Dubois a very slight favourite, I'm on about like 51-49 favourite, I don't see any way stylistically that those two could produce a boring or a bad fight. That one would be a war, a slugfest, and I, for one, would love to see it. Now, the third and final man that I would love to see Daniel Dubois in there with next, and this might upset a few of you, especially if you're Dubois fans, but hear me out, is Jarrell Jang. Imagine Dubois' last 2 fights read a Miller win and a Jang win. If they did, I don't see any heavyweight contender off the back of those last two fights having a better claim at a world title shot than Daniel Dubois. And I know that many people would make Dubois a heavy underdog in this fight, but I wouldn't be so sure. Listen, sometimes styles make fights, and we very quickly over those two fights learned that Zhang's style is all wrong for Joyce, but that doesn't mean Zhang's style is all wrong for every fighter he gets in a ring with. He lost to AJ in the amateurs. Whether you agree or not with the decision, you can't deny that he failed to conclusively beat Filip Hrgović. I actually didn't think that decision was as controversial as some people thought, and he fought to a hard labour draw earlier on in his career against Jerry Forrest. So, barring Joyce, I don't really think there's any standout names on Zhang's record as a pro yet, is there? But listen, let me give credit to Jang. I really like him. I think he's a top heavyweight. He punches very hard. And you know what? For someone of that size, he has really surprising speed. But the reward factor for this fight is so much greater than the other two fights that I had named. Zhang's the fight that would pay the most. It's a fight that would probably be fairly easy to make because we were led to believe that Frank Warren has now some sort of say over Zhang's next fight. I think he has an option to promote it. He's the highest ranked out of any of the names that I have just said. And also, in a weird way, you could think of this about sort of killing two birds with one stone, so to speak. Because if Daniel Dubois was to go in there and beat Zhang, then he can pretty much exercise the demons of the Joyce loss anyway, because he's just beat the fella that beat Joyce in back-to-back fights. Now listen, I really rate Zhang, by the way, and I believe he could be a top 5 heavyweight contender, but 2 wins over Joyce and a really tough fight with Hrgović that could have gone either way is not enough just yet, resume-wise, for me to put him ahead of Usyk, ahead of Fury, ahead of Joshua, even ahead of Hrgović himself, and a lot more names in that heavyweight division. He could beat all of them, or he could just be a really decent heavyweight contender with a couple of good recent wins. And I understand that if this fight was made, the bookies would probably have Jang as a slight favourite. Notice I say slight because you'd actually, or the general perception might sometimes be that Jang would be a massive favourite over Dubois. Honestly, if it ever gets made, which it probably won't, let's be honest, but if it does ever get made, just look, because the bookies won't have him as a massive favourite. Dubois does do some things that Jang can't. He has better feet than Jang, definitely. I also think he's got a better engine than Jang, and the youth factor's massive. He's a lot younger than Jang. I'd make Jang a favourite, but heavyweight boxing history is littered with fighters who weren't the favourite going and pulling off upsets. I don't even have to go Buster Douglas against Mike Tyson. Just look at the other night, a Day of Reckoning card. Obviously, Ajit Kabayel stops Makhmudov. That wasn't really in the script to happen. A lot of people thought Miller was going to beat Dubois. Going back through the heavyweight years, you know, Tyson Fury going to Dusseldorf and taking the belts off Vladimir Klitschko. I'm just saying it can happen at heavyweight, and you shouldn't be as shocked as and when it does. So I think it could happen, although Jang would be a slight favourite. But I do want to know, what do you guys think next for Daniel Dubois? Who would you like to see him in there with? Do you think Dubois can win a heavyweight world title because of his age? I think, what is he, 26? Do you think he should just sort of sit out, let this crop go, and then challenge the next crop of heavyweight fighters? Or do you want to see him straight back in there in big heavyweight showdowns? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you made it to the end of the video, please do me a massive favour. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you're not already. I'm working really hard, you know, to bang this sort of content out for you. So I'm very interested to read all of your comments, get back to as many of them as I possibly can. I will see you all in the next one.